On the night of March 8, 1971, 8 people broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, a small town outside of Philadelphia. Their goal? To steal secret FBI files. The burglars were successful and soon sent copies of the files they obtained to Betty Medsger. She was a reporter for the Washington Post at the time and went on to write the first stories about the files that showed that the FBI, under the direction of J. Edgar Hoover, had been spying on U.S. citizens. Well, now Medsger has written a book about her work on that story and the people who helped make it happen, the burglars, who for many years remained unidentified. She'll be at Ithaca College this evening to give a talk on her book, titled The Burglary, but now she's joining us by phone for a conversation about those events in Media, Pennsylvania, all those years ago. So, Betty, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So, just to get us started, I kind of glossed over the events of March 8th, 1971. I'm wondering if you can go into a little bit more detail about what actually happened that night.
They had a goal, not just to steal. They were on a search to find whether they could get documentary evidence that would prove whether J. Edgar Hoover was spying on Americans because of their political activity. There were many suspicions among activists that there were spies in their midst, informers, and it was creating a very poisonous atmosphere in the civil rights movement and at that time especially in the anti-war movement. And J. Edgar Hoover was a much beloved figure in American society, and the Bureau was also beloved. And so Bill Davidon, the mild-mannered physics professor from Haverford who got the idea for the burglary, decided this is so important. It took him a while to be convinced that these rumors might be true. He was really a kind of person who didn't like to speculate. He was concerned that the more rhetoric there was about the FBI is spying, that the more cynical people would become. But what he really believed was that if the American people as a whole, including those people who loved J. Edgar Hoover, if they were presented with documentary evidence that such spying was taking place, that they would want something done. So that was the goal, and it was achieved beyond anything that they thought possible when they looked at the 1,000 files, every file in the office that they removed that night.
So who were the people involved in this action? You mentioned that one of them was a physics professor. Were these people just regular folks like you and I? Were they activists? Can you kind of tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah, they were. I mean, they're now making public appearances, and that's what one of the strongest reactions of people to them. They look just like ordinary people. They look like you and me. And that's true, and that's sort of evidence of what can happen when ordinary people are willing to make extraordinary commitments. And by that I mean the fact that each one of them realized that by this act of resistance, that if they were arrested and convicted, that they could give up many decades of their lives. They were never arrested, despite one of the most massive searches in the history of the FBI. So specifically to describe who they were, there was Bill Davidon, and then John and Bonnie Raines. They were a couple. They were married, and at that time they had 3 small children under the age of 8. So this was an extraordinary decision for them to make, for both of them, to participate. And they made arrangements ahead of time for his brother and then later for her parents to raise their children if, in fact, both of them had to go to prison. And they had this belief that it was very important for parents not to sort of take or check out and feel that they didn't have an obligation to act as citizens when they saw a great injustice. John was a professor of religion at Temple University in Philadelphia, where he still teaches, and Bonnie was directing a daycare center at that time, and she went on to graduate school later and became an advocate for children's issues at the state, regional, and national level. And then there were 2 young guys, Bob Williamson and Keith Forsythe, both of whom had dropped out of school in order to demonstrate and plan and what they could do to try to stop the Vietnam War. I mean, they're indicative of a certain part of the peace movement that practically worked full time in those days to stop the war. And Keith he took a correspondence course and learned locksmithing skills so he could pick the lock the night of the burglary. In the end, that didn't quite work out, and he had to use a crowbar and a lot of physical effort to break in. And each of them had become deeply opposed to the war. Bob Williamson was from suburban New Jersey, and at the time was working as a social worker for the state of Pennsylvania. And then there were two more people who have their names have not been public, but they have told their story fully in my book. One of them was a graduate student at the time in the health professions, and what went on in the health professions. And the other was another academic in the Philadelphia area. And all of them, although their ages varied considerably, and their backgrounds in other ways, they all had learned the skills of burglary and this kind of commitment to resistance from the Catholic peace movement. And all but one of them had, in fact, been involved in a draft board raid prior to that time.
So I understand the burglary was successful, and these activists came away with all these documents. When did these first come across your desk? When did you first become aware of the fact that these papers existed?
10 days after the burglary, they met with each other for the last time and vowed that they wanted to take this the secret of the burglary to their grave. And the next day, John Raines mailed the first set of the copies of the files to 3 journalists, myself included, and 2 members of Congress, George McGovern and Perrin Mitchell, member of the House from Baltimore. All except myself returned the files, gave the files that they received to the FBI, but the Washington Post editors fought hard, and by the next day they were on the front page of the paper. I'd like to point out that the files that they stole were extremely important, not only for the important information that they revealed, such as that one of the goals of the FBI was to make Americans paranoid and to think that there was an FBI agent behind every mailbox, an explicit statement in one file, but also the use of workers on campus as informers against professors and students, and very importantly, the truly massive surveillance of black communities in Philadelphia, but also all over the United States. So that kind of information that was in the files was very important. But what was also very important was what those revelations led to, which included the revelation of COINTELPRO, which was a massive program of harassment and dirty tricks that Hoover had operated since 1956. A lot of people are familiar, perhaps, with one of the worst of those, which was a long-term effort to destroy Martin Luther King as a leader of black Americans, and that included the effort to try to get him to commit suicide shortly before he received the Nobel Peace Prize. Those revelations were so enormous, and they ranged from sort of crude and cruel to actually murderous, and having informers set up murders in the black community. They were so bad that it was impossible for Americans, after they learned about that, even people who had thought that Hoover was really terrific, it was impossible to ignore that. And that led then to the first congressional investigations of all intelligence agencies in 1975. And that led then to a series of reforms, including the establishment of the first official congressional oversight of intelligence agencies, and also to the strengthening of the Freedom of Information Act in 1974, which was really important, and that made it more possible for people to get copies of FBI files. The Freedom of Information Act had been passed in '66, and Hoover had instructed Bureau officials to ignore it. And now, after '74, that was no longer possible. And so that then led to scholars and journalists beginning then to apply for files, and for the first time, for the actual history, instead of Hoover's PR-driven history of the FBI, to stream out and for us to learn what was actually happening.
So if that was the fallout of the information within these files being revealed, I can imagine that the FBI and the government as a whole would be very interested in finding the people who perpetrated this burglary. Were they ever successful?
They definitely were almost desperate to find them. 200 and some agents were assigned to the case. It was called Medsger. Hoover wanted to arrest the burglars as fast as possible, and just as important, he wanted to confiscate the stolen material as fast as possible and prevent it from being distributed. And all those efforts failed, but it's not for lack of trying. A crucial mistake was made at the beginning of the investigation, and it concerns a man who lived here in Ithaca until he died several years ago, and that's John Peter Grady, who was a leader of the Catholic Peace Movement. And the FBI made the mistake of deciding, without any evidence, the day after the burglary, that John Grady not only was involved, but that he was the leader of whatever group did this, and their investigation focused on that to an extreme extent, including causing another group of people to be arrested in a draft board raid that those people had not wanted to continue, and the FBI felt that those people were the media burglars. They continued, even with those extreme actions, to never get any evidence. In fact, at the end of the investigation, in 5 years, when the statute of limitations ran out on burglary, they said that they never had any evidence, any physical evidence, or any direct or indirect witness with information about the burglary. So it was a failure all around. Now you ask, if I remember correctly, how the people managed to escape. Well, first of all, they were able to keep a secret. They didn't talk about it. They didn't talk to their friends. Even as the years passed and they saw that there were significant things were being accomplished as a result of what they did, they still kept their egos in check and did not reveal to people what they had done. The 7 of them made a decision to hide in plain sight, to just keep doing what they had done in the past and not make any attempt to hide. One of them, whom I couldn't find until very recently, did leave and go underground under an assumed name for many years. But the effort to hide in plain sight, where there was such a large peace movement in Philadelphia with thousands of people, many of whom became suspects, that decision happened to work out.
So I'm wondering how you eventually came to find out the identities of the burglars if they evaded the FBI for so long.
Well, it was quite an accident, and since I was involved at the beginning as the person who wrote the first stories about it, it was really remarkable happenstance that many years later, after I had moved to California and was teaching journalism, I had a weekend in Philadelphia and scheduled appointments with people I had known in the late 60s when I worked there as a reporter. And 2 of the people that I arranged to see were John and Bonnie Raines. And as we sat having dinner in their home, their daughter came in to ask one of them a question, their youngest child, Mary, and John turned to her and said, "Mary, we want you to know, Betty, because many years ago, when your dad and mother had important information about the FBI that we wanted the American public to know, we gave it to Betty." So I was stunned, and I asked them, "Are you telling me that you were media burglars?" And they had not planned on telling me. It was an accident, and I'm awfully glad that it happened. And I think now I think all of them are glad that they changed their minds and exposed the secret. My feeling when I got in touch with them later was that this was an important piece of American history, an important act of resistance, and that people needed to know about it. And by that time, they agreed with me, and they helped me find the others who also agreed that the story should be told.
And Betty, we just have time for one final question. Understanding the current environment that we're living in the wake of, Edward Snowden's revelations about NSA surveillance and that information that was leaked, of course, that has parallels to the story of Media Pennsylvania. So I'm wondering real quickly if I could just get your take on why it's important that this information about what the government is doing be made public in this kind of way.
Well, it's rather striking to see now that Edward Snowden has released the NSA files, and also with a great deal of care, by the way. He cares about national security, quite in contrast to the public statements that have been made by officials about the material being reckless and endangering national security. I think you'll find that that's not true, and he had the same kind of motivation. He was inside; they were outside, but he was inside, and he saw what was happening with the great expansion of surveillance, expanding to everyone, not only in the United States, but also to civilian populations in allied countries, and decided that it was very important that the public have this information and be able to make a decision about actions that were out of what he considered to be out of control by intelligence agencies. So it's sort of the same motivation that the public needs this, and I'm going to risk my freedom in order for the public to have this information. It's really the same motivation in 1971 and now. And what I think is really quite amazing when you think about it is that the only way that Americans have gotten information about out of control intelligence activities, the only way that Americans have been able to get that information has been by people, ordinary citizens, deciding that this is so important that they're willing to give up their freedom in order for the public to have the ability to have this information and make decisions about it.
Well, Betty, I wish we had more time to talk, but unfortunately, we're kind of hitting the top end of our time limit here. But thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. And for everyone listening, I've been speaking with Betty Medsger, former reporter for the Washington Post, about her book, The Burglary, that tells the story of the activists who broke into the FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania in 1971, exposing the Bureau's political spying and intimidation under J. Edgar Hoover. Betty, again, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me.
Thank you very much.